Okay. All right, we are live now. I think everyone online can hear me as well. Can everyone? I'm not going to use one of these handheld microphones for the people in the room, and I'm assuming you can hear me. I'll talk loudly. I want to apologize, especially to the people online, for our late start. You wouldn't know this, but we've had a big rainstorm here in Joburg, so traffic has been really bad, and so it's been harder to get going on time because people have been trickling in, they're stuck in traffic. And in fact, Eddie's family is still on their way, but we're gonna start without them. And I also want to welcome everyone here, but a very special welcome to Michael's family, who is joining us online, and Eddie's family will be joining us in person here as well. I just want to start by thanking the Sociology Department, as well as the National Institute of the Humanities and Social Sciences, NIHSS, for co-hosting this. Sociology is handing out the books. NIHSS is responsible for making it all look beautiful and smooth, and food and drinks. So you can see the division of labor here. I'm Michelle Williams from the Sociology Department, and I'm co-hosting this with Sarah Maswetsa from the HSRC, the Human Sciences Research Council. Human Sciences, until I said humanities. Human Sciences Research Council. You know that, right? Okay. And I also just want to say something that this might seem like a strange event. It's a memorial and a book launch. And there's a backstory to this. We were meant to launch Eddie's classic book, Cast in a Racial Mold, marking a year after Eddie's passing on the 5th of March, 2024. This was Michael's idea, and he wrote the new preface to the book. Michael was meant to be the keynote speaker at this event. And in fact, literally just before he passed away or was killed, we finalized his travel arrangements and everything. And so after Michael was tragically killed on the 3rd of February, Sarah and I were at a loss what to do. Beyond our grief, we could not imagine having to launch without Michael. But on the other hand, we also knew that Michael would insist that we still launch the book. But we felt we couldn't launch the book without speaking about Michael, who was not only one of Eddie's closest friends, and he was also extraordinarily dear and special to many of us in South Africa. So Sarah and I decided we should combine a memorial for Michael with the launch of Eddie's book. And we think Michael would approve, at least we hope he would approve. So this event is especially difficult for me because Michael was so much to me and Vish. It's hard to put in words, but I also know that he meant a lot to so many people around the world, and that there is an understanding of the depth of our collective and individual grief. Even 2 months after his death, the pain continues to be inconsolable. It's hard to imagine that I'll never have another conversation with him, never be able to get his advice, hear his views, share stories, tell jokes, enjoy a good meal that Vish and I would cook, because Michael was a horrendous cook. There are lots of stories about uncooked fish and instant rice. Michael could screw up instant rice. So I've heard Michael described as a British sociologist. He was not. He was British by birth and remained connected to England through his beloved sister, Norrie Graham, and her family. And of course, he also remained connected to England through his lifelong love affair with Manchester United. But he was not a British sociologist, and he was neither an American sociologist. Michael was truly a global sociologist with deep and enduring links to Africa. In fact, it was through his time in Southern Africa that Michael became a sociologist, a Marxist, and an ethnographer. These three defining characteristics of Michael Burawoy were born in Southern Africa. So while doing his undergraduate degree in mathematics at Cambridge University, at 19 years old, he hitchhiked across the African continent and spent the summer, for us the winter, of 1966 in Johannesburg. On this trip, he became interested in education as a means of social transformation. On this trip, He also met Eddie and Luli. In 1968, after graduating with his master's degree, he returned to Johannesburg for 6 months, working as a journalist. Then he moved to the newly independent Zambia, where the liberation movement also had a base. He registered to do his master's degree in sociology. They had just started a sociology program, and it started with 2 students and 1 dropped out. So it ended up with just Michael. He also worked on the copper mines in the personnel department. Encouraged by his lectures, he was gripped by the question of how capital was responding to independence. We knew how workers were responding. And so because we didn't understand how capital was responding, he studied the personnel data from the copper mines and found changes in the roles and responsibilities of particular grades of jobs. While the mines were deracializing, power and responsibility was moving upwards. Eddie called this upward floating color bar when he read Michael's book. He remained in Zambia from 1968 to 1972, and it was this time in the post-colony that shaped him into becoming a sociologist. It also introduced him to Marxism with a strong African inflection that took race and class seriously, and it is where he began his ethnographic method and the extended case study method. He left Zambia and went to Chicago for his PhD and pioneered his ethnographic method of working in factories. He then spent 47 years as a professor at UC Berkeley, where he was a legendary teacher and PhD supervisor, having supervised over 80 PhD students. That's remarkable in itself, but even more remarkable is that Michael could recount every single one of his students' PhD theses from the top of his head. It was actually quite intimidating when we can't remember your own arguments. He could tell you them. He created communities of care among his students. We didn't realize it at the time, but he was creating familial bonds among sociologists. He also created a global family of sociologists. He returned to South Africa in 1991 after the end of apartheid and came regularly ever since. He participated in SWAP and sociology research projects, mentored PhD students working on labor, and gave amazing seminar series on Marxism, Polanyi, Bourdieu, and Du Bois, actually in this room. And part of why we wanted the event in this room is because Michael and Eddie have spent so much time in this room. He also gave the famous keynote lecture at Eddie's retirement, where he described Eddie as a windmill, which really captured Eddie. And just last October, he gave a powerful solidarity lecture on Palestine and South Africa at the NIHSS offices. He remained tied to the continent and to South Africa throughout his life and had lifelong friendships with many South Africans like Luli and Eddie, and also the Wolpe family. In fact, I recently saw some letters between Michael and Eddie from the 1970s and 80s, which showed an intellectual partnership of respect, love, and commitment. So his commitment to a critical and engaged sociology around the world was born out of his understanding of sociology, that sociology had an immensely powerful role to play in addressing the difficult questions of our times. He never shied away from investigating these types of questions. It was not a career for him. It was a way of being. Being a sociologist for Michael was a complete existence and deep commitment to social justice, creating communities of care, and his lifelong friendships he forged. So today we have 4 wonderful speakers, all of whom had their own special relationships with Michael. And I'm giving each speaker 10 minutes, and I know we're running late, so I'm going to be very strict on time, but we built in a little break between the sessions. But we do have a tight program, and we're going to take the speakers in the order of the program. So Peter Wolpe, then Carl Van Holt, Marcel Perret, and Vish Sakar. And Carl and Marcel will be joining us online. They're already online, but they'll be joining us online. But I'm not very good at technology, and people in the room are laughing. So Peter, you can come. Yeah.
Can everyone hear me okay? Hi, my name's Peter Wolpe, and just to put a context, my parents were Anne-Marie and Harold Wolpe, and Harold would have been a Rivonia trialist had he not escaped from prison. And so we grew up in exile in the UK, and the whole family, my parents, myself, my sister Tessa, my brother Nick, returned at different times after 1990. And I'm really talking about the personal relationship with my family. I don't remember exactly when I first met Michael, but I think I was 15. But I do remember he was a very regular visitor to our home. He first met my dad, Harold, at Chicago University, where he was a postgraduate student. And he said, following that meeting, and whilst in London, I dared, so I'm doing a lot of quotes from Michael, I dared to visit Harold at his home in Onslow Gardens. Our first interaction was an argument as to whether absenteeism was a form of class struggle or not. He said Harold annihilated him, and after that he kept clear of politics, well, for that evening only. And he would come and go, and when he arrived, it was as if we'd seen him yesterday. And so the banter and the laughter would resume. He often said our house was his second home, and the Wolpe family, his adopted second family. He reminisced often about wonderful family meals, which Michelle, he didn't cook. And despite for us growing up with two academic parents, my father struggle activist and my mother feminist, we rarely spoke about politics or other such topics at the dinner table. But supper was a ritual, and we always ate together, talking about how our day had been and other probably fairly mundane things, but generally full of fun and laughter. Michael said, we all thought that we were preparing a meal together, including him, but actually it was Anne-Marie in charge of all the cooking, and he was right. He remembered, he wrote, he remembered Harold playing cards, which he did. He quite liked poker, doing poker, and frivolous joking with my sister, me and my brother, and getting a rise out of my mother. And that might include putting a milk bottle on the table instead of milk in a jug, or butter in a butter dish. And of course, Michael was not a passive participant in all of that. He was born in Manchester, and at the time his father was a lecturer at Manchester College, and his parents were from Russia and Ukraine, and my grandparents on both sides were from Lithuania. And I wondered, we never spoke about that, but since he died, I wondered if there was an unspoken affinity with that connection. He also said that we were an unusually tight-knit family, and perhaps that also drew him. And at some point, his family moved to London. But as we know, Michael studied abroad, spent time in South Africa, Zambia, and finally the US, teaching for many years at Berkeley. And in the 1980s, his mother was ill, and he would spend more time with her, which meant more frequent visits to our family home, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. My sister Tessa reminded me of a time she was in the US when she was about 20, and Michael was to accompany her home on the flight. And apparently she didn't stop talking for 1 second the whole flight because she's terrified of flying. And Michael said afterwards to my parents, a total and utter nightmare, and never again. And he never again flew with her. And yes, he was a Manchester United supporter. And my dad, I'm sorry to say, was an ardent Arsenal supporter. So they argued and talked football a lot. And he often arrived from a trip in Eastern Europe where he was undertaking research, even working in factories to study workers. And I remember as a teenager being amazed that he would live and work in these far-off places, but he always came armed with gifts for us children, maybe my parents as well, but I don't remember. And I still have the most beautiful little Russian box in which I keep the little bit of precious jewelry I have. And I always, whenever I use it, I think of Michael. I remember Nick, my brother, discovering in London in the late 1980s that our telephone, you know, when there were real telephones, had been bugged. And when he was sent tapes of conversations, which he said were dead boring, that were sent to the home. And it was totally hilarious because we realized that the wires were actually visible outside, but nobody had noticed. And it led to an article in the New Statesman called Carry On Spying. And Michael loved that story. And as he said, a thriller unfolding at Onslow Gardens. And of course, Amory and Harold and Michael did talk extensively about sociology, Marxist theory and politics over the years, and especially Michael and Harold. That was their deep connection. And I want to talk a little bit about that now. In 1981, Harold was approached by the then chair of the Department of Sociology at Berkeley, stating that Michael was in his 6th year as an assistant professor and was being reviewed for a tenure position. The chair asked Harold to provide an evaluation of Michael's work and compare his work to other American sociologists of his age cohort. I found Harold's 4 or 5 page evaluation letter to the chair, which I can send you a copy of. It's quite an amazing, beautiful tribute to Michael. And Harold was so thorough, and he starts by apologizing for the delay in sending the review, but said he had to reread Michael's recent and earlier publications. And if I had more time, I would love to quote more, but for now, this is what I'm quoting. This reading enabled me to, firstly, to appreciate the quality of Dr. Burawoy's intellectual and sociological maturation since his first publication, The Color of Class, on the Copper Mine, 1972. The increasing complexity and penetration of his analysis, the evidence of an ever-widening command of the literature reflected in quite disparate theoretical positions. Harold goes on to say, on rereading the earlier work, which he, Harold, was critical of, quote, proved their lasting worth by providing important insights which are relevant debates as they have now developed. Harold outlines specific analyses of Michael's work that I think you might be interested in, but I'm not talking about, and that he said illustrates the overall richness, depth, and importance of Michael's work. In relation to comparing Michael to other sociologists of his age cohort, which Harold clearly thought somewhat ridiculous, he says, quote, "It is obviously difficult for me to make such a comparison with confidence in relation to American sociologists. I may merely say that his contribution is as good as, indeed, on the whole, in advance of the very best sociologists of his age cohort in Britain. In my view, Dr. Burawoy would be an asset in any distinguished department of sociology." We all know how incredible Michael's work was, his dedication, his influence and commitment to not only Berkeley, here at Wits, and to numerous students and scholars over the course of his career. And Michael engaged with Harold's work and reviewed his writing. He also gave 2 lectures here in South Africa for the Harold Walpy Memorial Trust, that we set up after Harold's death in 1996. And one of the lectures was titled From Liberation to Reconstruction, Theory and Practice in the Life of Harold Wolpe in 2004. In the footnote, he says, "It is an honor to be giving this lecture. For nearly 20 years, I was a close student of Harold Wolpe's writings. It has been a daunting task to come to terms with them as a whole. In fact, far too big a task for a single individual. This lecture, therefore, is part of a collective enterprise nurtured and sponsored by the Wolpe Trust to continue the intellectual legacy of Harold Wolpe." And I just thought it's such a typical comment of Michael's, his modesty and his recognition of others. And in this lecture, he gives a brilliant account, I thought, of Harold's work, and later said it was based on my reconstruction of Harold's life and works, and he was part of my second family at Onslow Gardens. At the end, so I think it's important because it says something about Michael for me. But at the end of the lecture, Michael goes into some detail of Harold's intention to establish an institute of social theory, which would take as its starting point of departure not the priorities of the then government of national unity, but the need for a continuous critique of the social order. He went on to outline what that agenda of an institute could look like, based on Harold's accumulated writings and intellectual trajectory, to focus on the relationship between consciousness and organization, to destroy the old regime, I'll have to speed up, and build a new one. So I'm not going to finish that, but other just than to say that he spoke at a symposium we ran in October 23 to honor my parents. And I asked Michael to help me establish such an institute because we talked about it over the last few years, and he said a categorical no. But anyway, he gave us always a wonderful talk, so animated. So I'm skipping bits, sorry. I found a letter Michael wrote to Anne-Marie and Harold in December 1991, and I just thought there was an interesting paragraph. He spoke about his trip to Russia. He said, "I survived Russia without much mishap. I left before the coup, but as you can see from the enclosed, I'm not particularly impressed with the coup or with the self-congratulation about some second Russian revolution. Things are really quite desperate." I wanted to read something else, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to finish with two short quotes. So when my mother died, Michael wrote to me, "My dear Peter, I'm so sorry to hear this news. I last saw Anne-Marie a year and a half ago. Though she was already suffering badly, her spirit was indomitable, as testy as ever, giving her customary round of stimulation. She was quite an extraordinary woman, caring and forthright. She was my surrogate mother when my own mother was suffering for so many years." I had a bit more, but since I'm under time pressure, I'm just going to finish by saying, Michael said Harold was a mischief maker with a cheeky smile on his face, which was totally true. But I actually see that also in Michael. He was a beautiful and generous human being with the most wonderful smile that lit up his face. You couldn't help but smile or laugh, that warmed your heart. He always had such an engaging energy. He was part of our family. We loved him, and I miss him.
We need to go back one slide. Sorry, it's horrible being a timekeeper on an event like this, but we're trying to make sure we give everyone time. So Carl, you're next. And Vianney's going to give you a 2-minute warning online. And then I think by 11, I mean, we just went a little over 14, but we're going to really, please try to stick to as close to 10 minutes, 11 max as possible. And then we can be on time again. Yeah. So Carl, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I don't know what the 2-minute warning is about, but anyway, here I am, and thanks for inviting me. I'll be ready for the warning.
Okay.
So Michael was always a marvelous thinker, alert to ideas, testing ideas, reconstructing ideas. How did ideas fare in his company? How did they sparkle, come alive, grow, or wither? And what was our relationship here in South Africa? What was our relationship with him like? How did we learn from him? How did he learn from us? That's what I really want to talk about today. One of the methods through which Michael tested ideas was to put different thinkers in conversation with each other in order to explore the relationship between different ideas and different theories, to probe the disagreements, contradictions, resonances. And he did this notably with the ideas of Pierre Bourdieu. In my tribute, I want to discuss our relationship, that is, his and my relationship, particularly the way we engaged over ideas and how we learned from each other. So here I run the risk of talking too much about myself rather than Michael, but I hope it's a risk worth running with the aim of grasping something about Michael himself and about the nature of academic friendship, mentoring, and contestation. It started with 8 lectures on Bourdieu that Michael presented to Wits University in 2010. Michael's approach was one of constructing a comparative conversation between Bourdieu and 7 Marxist or neo-Marxist thinkers, that presented an intellectual feast ranging across past and present. Just as much of a tour de force was the intensity of his own intellectual energy as he ranged up and down the front and aisles of Southwest Engineering seminar room, talking and thinking, thinking and talking. He was like a tiger made restless with ideas, burning bright in the jungles of the mind. The seminar room was packed to overflowing. This was over a period of 8 weeks, and he held us all enthralled over the 8 weeks of his performance. I chaired the sessions, each of which concluded with a lengthy discussion. So Michael liked my own interjections and asked me to join him in a book project on Bourdieu. I said it was impossible because I was a complete novice as far as Bourdieu went. He said that was ridiculous and that I should simply approach it as if I was writing a novel. He knew that I was writing a novel at the time. This made for an intriguing challenge. It allowed me to take this thing on, and I agreed. It turned out to be a thoroughly enjoyable project, enabling me to gamble like a puppy around the feet of all the giants that he'd assembled in the book. So I felt like I was just tugging at their shoelaces and yapping in pleasure. Michael clearly enjoyed what I had written, except for my concluding piece, which he said would please the Bourdieu acolytes. It wasn't pleasing him, that's for sure. He had a way of letting you know when you had written something he thought was nonsense. He would grimace as if he had eaten something sour and shake his head. So I went back to the drawing board, went back to Pascalian meditations, and found a passage that I felt I could grapple with. In the end, we were both delighted by this, and that's what we published. He was teaching all the time. He was teaching me through this entire process. So that's the one conversation with Michael that I want to concentrate on in this tribute to him. I mean, there were others, of course, as everyone knows, like the critical engagement and public sociology and so on. But that's too much to really talk about. So that conversation continued past the lectures as I was working on various articles. It was a strange conversation, as Bourdieu was a very unlikely kind of candidate for me to have a conversation with. And I think it was Michael's own kind of intellectual energy around the project of grappling with Bourdieu and reconstructing him that sort of made me interested in pursuing Bourdieu. And the conversation that ensued between us was fundamentally about theory and the construction of theory. He himself was at heart a theorist, concerned with how we make sense of the world and how we come to understand it and how we might think of changing it. Generally speaking, he desisted from inventing new theory, but saw himself working with and against existing theories with a view to reconstructing them, building on, reorganizing, bringing into conversation with other theories. In relation to the monumental and forbidding figure of Bourdieu, he said I should simply play around, a bit like a puppy, play around with him, disassemble his theoretical constructions, and put them together in different ways, experiment, see where it takes me. The purists will be up in arms, he said, but don't worry about them. There was something marvelously freeing about this advice. He helped to demystify theoretical work for me and empowered me to undertake such work for myself. Our conversation reached a marvelous peak in 2021 when he agreed to present the vote of thanks for my inaugural lecture. So this was probably at the height of a kind of disagreement between us and a degree of tension over the critique that was being developed by myself and other colleagues of Michael's concept of public sociology. So I was a little bit unsure whether he would still feel comfortable with eulogizing me, as is the practice at these events. But he agreed without hesitation and gave a wonderful address, dense with ideas and new thoughts. Indeed, he tested the limits of the normal kind of quite staid and formulaic vote of thanks, which is more celebratory than kind of substantial. He engaged seriously with my ideas as they developed over a 30-year period. And at the end, he presented a novel application of my own reconstruction of Bourdieu and used it to critique me. In other words, he took this moment seriously as an opportunity for pursuing our conversation further. And I can hardly think of a more wonderful way to respond to an inaugural lecture. Now, because his response to me will never be published now, I think it's worth quoting it a little bit more fully. So what he does is he engages, let me put it this way, what I do with Bourdieu is I take his idea of different fields of practice that are sort of like horizontally organized spaces in society where order is maintained, conflict is absorbed, and so on. And what I argued is that any social site has got a number of fields of practice, each with different rules and different kind of ways of engaging. And this sets up a conflict between them, and that's how we can understand disorder and struggle. So he applies this idea to the university, and in fact to the idea of critical engagement, which we were working on at the time, which was Eddie's idea about public sociology. So he asks, well, basically what he does is he argues that the university is a site of three fields arranged one on top of the other. The first is the academic field, which is about teaching and research and about those who learn as well as the administration that makes it all possible. But on top of that is an economic field of scarce resources in which the university depends on fees, government subsidies, cost cutting. Struggles in that field reverberate into the academic field. Then on top of these two fields, there is a third field, what we might call a racialized political field that generates struggles around decolonization and social justice. And this further disrupts the economic field and the academic field that are part of the university. It is this perpetual crisis that undermines the autonomy of the university, so that engagement in the world of politics and social justice is inescapable in the social sciences. And we struggle as academics to retain some autonomy, some critical distance. This radical disarticulation of fields sprang to life in the Fees Must Fall insurgency. In brief, he says, we might say that the South African university is critically embedded in society, and its sociology reflects that embeddedness. And this is why South African sociology is exceptional in both senses of the word, and it is also why it is so fraught and tense, why it is so exciting and yet so demanding, why South African sociologists look like windmills caught in a maelstrom. So that, in a way, explains or gives some sense of his excitement about South African sociology. So I want to move towards a conclusion now, or the end of the tribute, by recalling a conversation I had with Eddie a month or so before he died. We were discussing Michael, actually, because Eddie was writing a paper about Michael, a tribute to him on his retirement. And Eddie made the point that unlike any of the other sociologists from the northern countries, Michael actually took seriously the work of South African sociologists, engaged with it, and was influenced by it. And it's that excitement that comes through so strongly in the passage I've quoted above. So I think that's a very interesting point to make about Michael, is this kind of continuous learning and engagement with us in South Africa. Now, Michael was not only a thinker, of course. He was also a wonderfully warm, funny, and concerned friend and human being. I have to say I loved that man. He used to say that he had never laughed as much as when he spent time with Eddie and the swap team. He and Adele, my partner, also loved and enjoyed each other. He would come for lunch as much for her company as mine. I think he appreciated her warmth and energy and irreverence, as well as her concrete political engagement. He was planning to visit us in Cape Town in March, this past March. And that really brings me back to his response to my inaugural lecture, to, in a way, the kick in its tail. He'd organized the lecture around the idea of 4 encounters over a period of, 30 years, 4 encounters with me and with my own thinking. Hello, sorry.
Okay, so Carl, can you wrap up quickly then?
Yeah, I'm wrapping up right now.
Okay.
So I was saying that the kick in the tail of his inaugural lecture he'd organized it around the idea of 4 encounters with me over a period of 30 years, and he ends it like this. I leave you with this question. Is South Africa leading the world as the university, even in the north, even as the university in the north is buffeted by the gales of neoliberalism, the polarization of politics, and the battles around decolonization? I look forward to the answer to this question in our 5th encounter in the year 2030. There will never, of course, be that encounter. Instead, I've tried here to present the living Michael Burawoy as I knew him, in hopes that he will continue to inspire us and bring us joy, even if he is no longer among us.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl. That was wonderful. We'll move straight on to Marcel Perret, and he's also from linking in. Marcel, you have 10 minutes, and Vianney's going to give you a 2-minute warning, okay?
Okay.
Marcel?
They disabled my video. So
2-minute warning is, unlike Carl, right?
Yes. They disabled my video, so they have to put it back on.
Okay, turn on, and then just so people know, Marcel, I don't know if he's introducing himself, but I'll quickly, since people in this room might not know him. He was also a PhD student of Michael's who worked on South Africa and has written on South Africa and lived for many years. And is also a good friend of mine and Sarah's. So we also wanted to include, where is he? Okay, we're getting you up on the screen, Marcel.
All right.
Can you see us?
No.
Show him on the Zoom side. It's just in the room.
No. But my video is on. So you just let me know when you want me to go.
No, don't do it.
Okay, just a second. We're just
Unpin.
we're gonna unpin this one.
Unpin.
Remove
The
it.
room, but just remove the pin. Here we go.
Ah, now
You can
no,
put in that.
no. How do we see? Oh, there you are. Now we see you. Yay! Okay, your time starts.
Okay. I've got a timer here too, so I'll watch on my end. I can't see you all, but it's an honor to be here to remember 2 great humans, Eddie and Michael. And I know I'm tasked with speaking about Michael, but 2 of a kind. You know, I got to know them both around the same time. And, you know, I got to know Eddie as a result of Michael. And both devoted so much of their lives to sociology. Both were committed to social justice. And both were kind and generous and warm human beings. So it makes me happy to know that they were friends, and it just makes sense. And it makes sense that we're having this event today. I knew Michael best during my time as a PhD student at Berkeley, but it was under Michael's guidance that I first started to learn about South Africa and eventually came to research and eventually live in Johannesburg. And some of my best memories of Michael were when he visited South Africa. You know, he would always tell me that he lived multiple lifetimes when he visited South Africa, which held a special place in his heart. You know, his friends here, all of you who were there listening, and the politics and sociology that was being undertaken in South Africa rejuvenated him. And he learned so much from South Africa, as Carl was talking about as well. And of course, it helped to spawn his own concept of public sociology, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. So, you know, before I kind of dig into what I want to say about Michael, there are four qualities that I think really, you know, stand out to me. There are many things about Michael, but, you know, he was a brilliant thinker. That's probably the thing that most people in the world know him for. He did great sociology. He has famous 2x2 tables, very clear thinker and theorist. He was also charismatic, which of course came out in his teaching and his mentoring and also his public speaking. Thirdly, he was kind. He was always respectful of others, no matter what their status was. And one of the amazing things, watching the outpouring of support for Michael over the last couple months, is just how many people's lives he touched, and how many people he sort of made feel special. And that was one of the amazing things about Michael. Finally, fourthly, he was curious about the world, and he was always willing to learn. He was open. Impressively, he was always open to critical feedback, even as he was sort of stubborn and committed and outward and public about his beliefs. It was an amazing sort of combination of qualities. And his openness to critical feedback is one of the greatest qualities that I hope to mirror in my own life. So for me, it was the combination of these four qualities that really made Michael so special. But I want to take the rest of my time to talk about Michael and his analysis of sociology and where he fits into that. As many who are watching this will know, Michael famously divided sociology into four types. There was the professional sociology, focused very much on sort of academic debates. There was the critical sociology, which constantly sought to push those debates forward, adding in kind of a normative bent, a sense of morality. And then on the other side, there were policy sociology, oriented towards shaping policies through sociological knowledge. And then there was public sociology, right? Both of those oriented to communities beyond the academy. At his core, my belief is that Michael was a critical sociologist. That was who he was more than anything else. And this is what drove him and what devoted, what generated most of his energy. He is certainly one of the greatest Marxist thinkers to have ever walked the planet. And that is no small feat. Of course, there are many, many great Marxist thinkers. And it's important to remember him as one of those. But he was constantly engaged with professional sociology as well. And that engagement eventually led him to, ascend the ladder of sort of professional status, becoming the president of both the American Sociological Association and the International Sociological Association. And he was constantly trying to leverage that position to infuse Marxism, his critical sociology, into professional sociology, thus his idea of sociological Marxism. But what about public sociology? Of course, this is something that was core to his engagements in South Africa over the last 15 years or so, culminating in the great volume that Carl and others have put out on critical engagement, which of course, as he mentioned, came from Eddie. And there are affinities and differences between public sociology and critical engagement, which I don't have time to go into here. But I think it's interesting that Michael didn't really view himself as a public sociologist. Rather, he saw himself as his biggest supporter. But I think he was a public sociologist. And to see this, I think we have to recognize that there are two types of public sociology. There's the traditional and the organic. I like to think of these two types of public sociology as running in opposite directions. So the traditional public sociologist seeks to disseminate their knowledge widely to publics all around. Conversely, the organic public sociologist seeks a much deeper engagement with communities beyond the academy. And the organic public sociologist looks to these communities and dialogue with them as the source of knowledge, and then brings that knowledge back into the academy. So it's my belief and my sort of thesis here in my last couple minutes that Michael was an organic public sociologist, even if he didn't necessarily see himself as one. I think this is evident in his labor ethnographies, which put him into dialogue with workers on the shop floor, from Zambia to Hungary to Chicago to Russia. It's evident in his methodology, the extended case method, which is organized around dialogues beyond the academy. It was evident in his activism around Palestine, which occupied much of his the last year of his life. And it was especially evident in his teaching and his mentoring to so many students, both formally and informally. Right? He was such a great teacher because he was so eager to learn and to dialogue with all kinds of publics, students foremost among them. He always talked about students as the most important public for sociologists. And he treated the classroom and his mentorship as a dialogue, not only disseminating knowledge, but more importantly, gaining knowledge and facilitating that dialogue. His public sociology, the organic kind, was the lifeblood of his critical sociology. Michael's public sociology, organic public sociology, took him across the globe, and he was very much committed to developing a global perspective on the world. He knew that he couldn't do that on his own, and his teaching and his mentorship extended his reach. So through dialogues with colleagues and students, he truly did develop a global sociology. Ultimately, though, it was his kindness and generosity that we will remember. Yes, he was brilliant, and yes, he was charismatic, but he was also curious and kind, which made us love his brilliance and his charisma that much more. Let's keep Michael's spirit alive by pushing a sociology and social science that is kind, critical, organic, and global. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcel. You were on time, but I also loved your ending about keeping our kindness alive, which I think Michael would love. Okay, so our last but not least speaker is Vish Statkar. And he's here, so he'll be speaking from the podium.
Okay. What are you doing? Okay. I can just speak from here, right? So, Peter, like Harold was asked to send a letter reviewing Michael's work, my university asked Michael to review my work for my promotion. And by all accounts, it was very generous and glowing. I didn't expect to be here today doing this. So, something. Okay. So I'm not a family friend of Michael's or a career sociology or one of his students. I think I was his friend for about 20 years, but Michael was, for me, a Marxist elder. He was the third generation of Marxists, formed after World War II, impacted by 1968 anti-colonial struggles and the anti-apartheid struggle. So myself, Michael's greatness for me is for us to locate him in this third generation of Marxists, alongside Althusser, alongside E.P. Thompson, alongside Polantzis. He brought sociology to Marxism and Marxism to sociology, like his dear friend Eric Olden Wright. And yes, he was based in the US, but through sociology and the kind of engagement with Marxism, he had a global impact. Now, there are other Marxist elders in this third generation, like Marta, Martha Haneke, Samir Amin. Paul Singer from Brazil, Hilary Wainwright, Thomas Isaac, and so on, who basically were about confronting the late 20th century crisis of Marxism and about the defense and reconstruction. Yeah.
So just for those online, we're taking just a second for Vish to compose himself. This has been a tough couple months for us. So just give us a sec.
Yeah. Michael had a lifelong association with South Africa. And I argue there's three moments in this. The first is when he discovered Marxism, and here as a master student of Simons, Jack Simons. The second moment was putting Marxism to work to understand the social formation and the labor process. And this was in dialogue with people like your father, Harold Wolpe, but also Eddie Webster. The third moment was defending and reconstructing Marxism, and that was with my generation. So Michael has had a multi-generational relationship to South Africa, which spanned most of his life. To take forward his commitment to defending and reconstructing Marxism, we hosted him over 15 years at WITS and shared him with unions and other academic colleagues. We hosted him on the Wolpe platform, the Democratic Marxism platform, and the Emancipatory Futures Studies platform. From these lectures, we learned that the tree of Marxism was not dogma, not static. We learned that Bourdieu did not ground his conceptions of capitals, cultural and otherwise, in an understanding of capitalism. We learned that Polanyi was about the double movement, which could go in any direction unless Gramsci's counter-hegemony was present. We learned that Fanon was about radical class agency. We learned that Du Bois belonged in the sociological canon. But we could not lionize him to the point of occluding the limits of his Marxism. If we took on board these lectures and you had a deep intersubjective engagement with Michael, you would understand that the past of national liberation politics. I want to just transition very quickly to talking about Michael's Marxism. Yes, Michael discovered his Marxism in Africa, but as he says, he discovered his antinomian Marxism in the factory floor, in the mine shaft, and at the blast furnace. He did not come to Marxism from the summits of the Politburo, looking down on society. There are three aspects of Michael's antinomian Marxism, which I want to highlight. The first is the two faces of his Marxism, and Ernest Bloch is the best person to think with about this. The cold stream of scientific analysis and the warm stream of ethical critique, and values-based praxis and utopia. Michael straddled both of these. His scientific approach to Marxism was not stuck in positivism. He didn't believe that facts added up to truth. He didn't believe that quantitative metrics helped you understand deeper social processes. He also wasn't He didn't have affinities with Marx's understanding of the laws of nature applying to society. So for Michael, Marxism was a scientific research program. And it was inspired by Imre Lakatos. And for him, that meant that as a research program, it had to confront the anomalies of history, the puzzles of history, the inconvenient truths of history. And he grounded this in his extended case method, which was really a marrying of macro-historical theory and ethnography, as well as global sociology. So on the one leg, on the one face was the scientific Marxism, and on the other was the swarm stream. And it comes out best in his embrace of the Real Utopia's Real Utopia's project of his dear friend, Eric. Yeah. So Michael was aware that Michelle and I were working on a project for 14 years in 15 countries, 368 interviews, 148 case studies, and about world making from below. And he understood these two faces of Marxism were present in this project. But in all our engagements, our dinners with him in Berkeley, dinners at our house, he was always pushing us to accentuate these two faces of Marxism in this project. The second aspect of Michael's Marxism is his self-reflexivity. Michael had this conception of the tree of Marxism, and you could place third world Marxism on it, Soviet Marxism on it, Western Marxism on it, and so on. And when he went into the labor process in Hungary and in Russia, the Lenin works and so on, he recognized the despotic labor regime. And he understood how this fed into the collapse of the Soviet Union and its transition from communism to capitalism. And essentially, this was about a degenerate Marxism, Leninism. This branch of the Marxist tree was not emancipatory for Michael. For Michael, Michael was about a Marxism about Marxism. And it was about, if you want to think about this notion, it's about bringing class analysis to bear on the SACP, COSATU, and ANC alliance, for instance, and I'm sure it'll terrify the hell out of you. Michael loved the Democratic Marxism series because he recognized that it was about this dialogue between the tree of Marxism, Marxisms in the plural, but also with other anti-capitalist currents today. Michael, this is the third aspect of his Marxism. He was unrepentant as a Marxist, in his own words. And he came at the end of the history thesis from the standpoint of his two faces of Marxism, his open Marxism and his self-reflexivity. And basically for him, capitalism would always be haunted by the promise of democratic socialism. And this is one of my quibbles with him because he wasn't ecological enough. And that is, capitalism will always be haunted by the promise of democratic eco-feminist socialism. Okay, I'm almost done. The final point I'll make is just about the amazing 2004 ISA that Michael convened in San Francisco to mainstream global public sociology. I was lucky to be one of the few invited guests to be present. And it was amazing watching Michael wheel out these big guns, Arundhati Roy, Cardoso, the former president of Brazil, and Mary Robinson, to make his case for global public sociology. And for Michael, in the tail end of his life, he was increasingly concerned of what was happening to the university, the unmaking of the public university. and he turns public sociology onto the university. And basically for him, this meant confronting the extractivism that was taking place in universities of academic knowledge, confronting the squeeze on students through higher fees, the kind of increasing top-down managerialism, and so on. So basically, Michael and his collaborators understood that the future of the public university required a struggle for greater public resources, including taxation, to support public universities. This is a struggle we also face, and I think Michael would have been proud if we rose to the challenge and demanded wealth taxes to defend public higher education and ensure public goods, if we demanded increased taxes on companies to have public education and higher education and more public goods, and demanded the implementation of the Zondo Commission so we don't have resource leakage and waste. Amandla, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vish. So this ends our first part of the evening, and I just want to say thank you to all the speakers. It's been a tough time for us, as you can see, and I think everyone who spoke today had their own, as well as, I mean, everyone here and many places had their own special relationship with Michael. That was one of his big, as Marcel said, one of his incredible defining features. He was kind, generous, naughty, feisty, cranky, mischievous, but he cared about people and he cared about all those in his life. So Michael was a lodestar of building a global sociology community. He believed sociology had an important role to play in making the world a better place. And he believed in all of us and sociologists around the world. And one of my friends says that sociologists were a bit imperial. We consider pretty much all fields in the social sciences sociology. So he believes in all of us as sociologists in this broad sense of the word. Michael dedicated his life to this, and it is a journey that he was on with us. And I'm certain that Michael would want us, even expect us, to carry on and to keep fighting for a better world. For me, this is hard to do without him, but we promised that we will try and we will never give up. There are, I think right now, so there's refreshments in the foyer with some drinks and food to refresh. I'm going to ask, instead of a 30-minute, we're going to say 5, knowing that that'll be 10, but we really want people to try to be back in 5 so we can catch up on our schedule. So for those online, if you want to also take a 5-minute break, and then we'll reconvene in 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. Ari? 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 Ari?
Yes, Ari. Yes, Ari.
How are you?
Sometimes very well. How are you?
Good. We'll start in about 2 minutes.
Okay.
Cool.
Where's my coffee?
Maybe we should start. We'll only be proper. I'm taking instructions from Michelle, who doesn't.
So
All right.
I don't have. Oh yeah. Okay. Now I can handle my world.
All right.
Right.
Then I said this to John.
Mm-hmm.
Most of our books are anti-capitalism. So therefore, when we come to a book launch, it does not make sense to continue with capitalism by selling the knowledge, right? So everyone who's here, if you don't have a copy of the book, it's your fault. There's no machine there that you need to click and use the same thing that we are criticizing that Eddie indeed stood against. So everyone should have a book. Please make sure that you have a book. My name is Sarah Musweta. One of the things that I know definitely that Michael and Eddie gave me is a gift of friendship. So we've been working at this with Michelle for a few months now. By way of just acknowledging this moment, I think it will be good for us to stand and have a moment of silence. Thank you. You may be seated. In the preface, I want to read, Michael says this about Eddie. Edward Webster passed away on the 5th of March, 2024, leaving an inspiring legacy. Eddie, as he was known to friends, colleagues, and students, was a leader in anti-apartheid sociology and then turned into to wrestle with the challenges of post-apartheid South Africa. Very nervous. Educated at Rhodes and Oxford, he turned his focus to labor studies on taking into his first job at the University of Natal. Just after the insurgent Durban strike of 1972, I thought I was going to be able to read that. Okay. So this is a jointly organized book launch, and in memory of Eddie, and of course in memory of Michael, by Wits Sociology and the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And I want to just give a bit of background. In 2013, the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences was indeed established as per the brilliant work by Ari, who's also going to be addressing us, supported fully by the then Minister of Higher Education, these days, Professor Nzimande. There were a number of projects that we needed to initiate immediately as we started to incubate this National Institute. And the first one of the first big projects, we called it the Hidden Voices. And in the Hidden Voices project, we also wanted someone to champion the Hidden Voices project who would know what what needs to be done. And Eddie submitted a proposal, and contrary to some people somewhere who will remain nameless, had a contract with the NIHSS and fulfilled those obligations, even exceeded those obligations. I'll tell you what he was able to do in a very short space of time in the Hidden Voices project. 6 books. 4 books in particular, and I want to talk about the 5, 6, and 7. It was the Alfred Temba Gabula's work, and the title of that work was A Working Life Cruel Beyond Belief. The second one, working with Kelly Forrest, was Bonds of Justice, The Struggle of Ogasi. The third one was with Mandla Ngosi and Petros, with an introduction by Paul Stewart. And the title of that work was The Story of One Tells the Struggle of All, Metal Workers Under Apartheid. And then lastly, with Jean, it was on the life of Jabu Ndlovu. I'm saying all of this because I think all of this were hidden voices of individuals whose stories needed to be told, and Eddie delivered on that. Beyond that, of course, delivered on the National Question book. There were other 2 hidden voices books, and the 4 were published by Jacana. The other 2 books were indeed inspired by Eddie. Had enormous conversations with Eddie about both, where one was published by UKZN Press and the other one by Jacana. The Jacana one was The White People by Michael Hamel. Suggest all of you get a copy, and if you don't have a copy, more than happy to send one your way. The double edition by UKZN was by Magema Fuze, The Black People, Hence They Come. And we also made sure that it was also in isiZulu, Abantu Abamnyama Lapha Bavela Khona. Little did I know that the other hidden voices that was going to be republished in 2025 by Wits Press is cast in a racial mold, and that is what brings us here today. I absolutely know that Eddie would not have agreed for us to put Cast in a Racial Mold as one of the hidden voices to be republished. So good timing, Eddie, good timing. It was not our idea, Michelle, you know that. It was Michael's idea. And the kind of relationship that we had with Michael, especially as we were having dinner, a well-cooked meal, that as he gave us that clear instruction of what we needed to do, Michelle and I also gave him clear instructions of what he needed to do. We said, we will do that, but you are writing definitely a preface. And he said, I can't argue with that. As Michelle said, the day that he submitted the preface was the day that he passed on. Remember arguing with Gege, why does Michael still not have his ticket to travel to the HSS 10th awards? And Gege said, I don't know which airport, but hang on a bit. I don't need Michael to be confirming which airport. I know exactly which airport he's going to be traveling from the US. And we finalized all details. And at that point, little did we know that he had already passed on. We're here to celebrate Eddie and the work. And there are 4 people who need to say something to us. Thank goodness. But as Michelle knows me very well, apparently I can get carried away and not say the right things that I'm supposed to say. Let me say that if it wasn't for Wits Press, if it wasn't for Veronique, we would not indeed be sharing this special moment. So from us, Michelle and everyone else who's gathered here, let me thank Wits Press. Let me thank particularly Veronique. There was one email where I thought it was all gone. And just 2 sentences from you rescued the project. And I want to thank you very much. I also want, obviously, to thank the sociology department and everyone else is here from NIHS's side, from Michelle and I, the sociology department. I know that we've lost so much in the last few months, but I think that this moment also affords us the moment to celebrate the person who I know brought all of us as sociology together. To Ingrid, and Josephine and others who made sure that we are here today, thank you very much. To Oriel, I think I'm taking instructions from Oriel all the time, so I'm here again. Oriel, thank you. I also want to thank the Vets Events team that has also brought us here, and everyone else who's contributed. Before I hand over to everyone who needs to say something, I said to Peter that we should stop meeting like this. The last time we met, we were honoring Nick Walpe, and today we are honoring Eddie and Michael. But it is only befitting that we honor such amazing souls. So with that, I think I'm doing well. I see in terms of other time-wise and other things. So let me start off with Ari. Ari, you have 10 minutes, and you and I have always agreed on this, having worked on over 15 years, that I just scream and then you keep quiet when time is up. I'm joking, Ari. You can continue.
Thank you. Audible?
Yes.
Thank you. I mean, we're dealing with two worthy ancestors at the moment. You know, we can speak about what I owe Michael, what I owe Eddie, but I think because we're launching a book, I need to skip that and move to the importance of the book itself. But as a parenthesis, just thanks to Michael, who spent a year in Berkeley in 1993, partly thanks to Michael, another year in 2000. So, I could have been speaking about Michael, but others did a great job. Casting a Racial Mold is the first labor process sensitive book that was published in South Africa. Full stop. It is a book that deals with the complexity of class and race on the shop floor. And through that, Eddie, using a theory of segmented labor markets, he managed to show how race persisted in metalworks, in those primary processes of production, where those unskilled, inverted commas, jobs, which is nonsense as a word, were carried out by Zulu migrants. And the more skilled jobs were carried by, guess what? White, already de-skilled artisans. So the book in itself is the beginning of a published adventure in labor studies. But now we have to think very carefully of how that was possible, because things don't drop from the sky. Things don't just evolve out of a spontaneous combustion. Remember, the university system opened up to the possibility of industrial sociology because there was a trade union movement that was asserting itself in all corners of the country, starting from the Durban strikes, Durban, East Rand, Eastern Cape, Cape Town, and so on, creating a kind of a tension in the system. So even the most conservative people at universities opened up a space for the possibility of industrial sociology. And Eddie, being brought by Dan Mahmoudi from Durban, fitted perfectly in this equation, starting studies of industrial sociology. And from then, if it started them, so space was opened up at Natal, at UCT, and it grew up from there. So it was not, as it were, a gift by the university system. It was a gift by thinkers who were relating to the labor movement and engaging with a transformation that was to bring the apartheid system to its close. So that opening, Eddie took up with gusto. I remember, there were two books that defined Eddie's scholarship, curriculum, more than scholarship. It was Hugh Bainon, Working for Ford, 1973, and then Harry Braverman, Labor and Monopoly Capital, 1974. So let's do labor studies, he thought, because we believed in a promise that the industrial working class, but then predominantly semi-skilled Black workers, were beginning to assert their autonomy, their creativity, and their challenge to the system. And the promise was somewhere there. And I will bore you with two little ethnographies, because it's very important not to forget how things developed. And I use the word ethnography in horror, because it is a linguistic abomination. If you're serious about languages, ethnography is the way through which you inscribe ethnos onto your subjects of investigation. It is a gift of the imperial period, and we have grabbed it and used it as a shorthand for qualitative and engaged and meaningful work with communities and struggles. But anyway, I will say ethnography 1, ethnography 2, forgive me. And forgive my ancestors, because it came from those stupid parts my ancestors came from. Ethnography 1, it would have been inconceivable to have labor studies without the work of a whole range of students that came into industrial sociology at WITS, who were doing essays. Second year, you had to do a project, essays around those issues, honors thesis eventually. The honors thesis, including mine, were more than 150 pages those days. I remember in second year, me and a friend did a study of all the strikes that happened, published by Work in Progress later, but was only given 65% by another lecturer, not Eddie, because it was too radical. So anyway, the amount of students that gravitated towards industrial sociology, together with people who were writing for the South African Labour Bulletin, created a kind of an infrastructure of insights into the mining industry, into clothing industry, into metalworks, and so on. So that must not be forgotten. And those things were the elements that allowed then the proper theorization of the labor process, trade union movements, and social movements to emerge. They're somewhere there, scattered all over. But ethnography number 2, the choice was about the metalworks. I was yanked from the Institute of Race Relations and placed into the African Studies Institute by Phil Bonner and Eddie Webster to look at the metal industry, to do the basic research of who produces what the history was, what created this industrial base in the country. And that empirical work that was happening there said, okay, the East Rand is the heart of the metal industry. Oh God, Durban is not. Vanderbilt Park is declining. So anyway, the basic geography of metal production was there in place for further things to happen. So there was the metalworks was very important. And NUMSA, then it was MAU, and then became NUMSA, were very open to investigations around there. Second came theater. For some absurd reason, I was involved in performance, and we were doing plays in working class areas. And then came Halton Cheadle and said, hey, you idiots, you are talking working class, but I have a group of workers out there who have been on strike in a foundry, who are very good performers because they performed what happened to them, to us as lawyers, for their case. They're all dismissed, they're all illegal, they're all hiding in the hostels, but perhaps go and make a story out of this, Junction Avenue. So Sipiwa Kumalo and myself went to the East Rand for 3 months every night in the hostels and did something. And those are the people that were introduced to Eddie and to others as the beginning of the study of the metalworks, or what became cast in a racial mold. Me and others moved towards the hostel system and what that meant, and also to urban metalworkers. And he did a hell of a lot of studies. So what created the possibility of cast in a racial mold was this focus on the metalworks, Eddie's thing. My PhD, has never been published, but it was about all that area. And then the third one was Carl van Holt's Witbank in terms of high-volt steel. So that became, in a sense, the heart of the energy around the industrial working class, providing a promise for the future. And the book is a kind of reminder of that moment. Now, yes, there were critiques. We were all focusing on masculinity and macho of kind of the working class. There were wonderful studies, more sensitive to gender. Bridget Penny opened up the space in terms of gendering our understanding in the labor process, which opened up the space for old work, maids and madams, because also another area of work for gendering systems to come into sociology. And Witz moved towards the apartheid workplace and the transformations necessary in order to create a post-apartheid workplace, and lots of work happened there. We in KZN by then were looking at a different concept, colonial managerialism, through which Izinduna workers were being controlled. And the struggle between Izinduna and shop stewards became a violent focal point for a lot of our understanding. So it was a kind of understanding was around the colonial Induna system and how it was operated. And of course, the rise of trade unions created managerial initiatives to take industrial sociology students and make them personnel managers, especially if they were Black kind of students with talent, to become the Black personnel managements who replaced the Izinduna in the industrial system as we know it. And that's where Blade Zimanda's PhD comes in, studying this first generation of Black personnel managers who were supposed to be a boy to the boss and a boss to the boys, replacing the Izinduna. So that's the context around which cast in a racial mold stands. But now there are new generations of labor studies students who have understood precarity, and Eddie also moved towards precarity. We're looking at zamazamas, we're looking at farm labor, we're looking at all kinds of labor studies, knowing well that the industrial working class, that promise, is still being promised but never arrives as we are busy industrializing. Anyway, and we're a reminder, this book, about the possible that still is not in place. And as our younger generation kind of awakened towards labor studies after the Marikana moment, we hope that they will be much better than all of us, much better than Eddie, than me and others, in terms of understanding the complexity of the experience of working life in a world that's turning in absolute cruelty against working people. And we hope that they take the baton and make us all envious from our ancestral space. Thank you.
Muted. Thanks, beautiful. Thanks, Ari. And indeed, there are many PhDs that have emanated that come from this one amazing book. And I was looking at Timothy's here, and many others that are, and everyone who's sitting here. We are Bridget, you next? Yes. Are you? Okay, cool. You want to?
Okay, hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I have both of them. Because how can you give up this? And this is typical, right? It's got millions of little posty things. It's got coffee spilled all over it. It's bent and broken. And here we have the new one. Okay, so Cast in a Racial Mold is a book that definitely needed to be reprinted. Sort of like Timothée Chalamet doing a Bob Dylan epic movie, and suddenly young people are introduced to Bob Dylan. I feel like the printing of Cast will enable a whole new generation to read this book. And, you know, I was just asking Tabong. Tabong said he gives the first chapter. It's a book that isn't easy to prescribe, right? Because it's so dense. And also for sociology students, it's so historical. Yeah. Sociology students don't like their history very often. So I'm hoping that this will expand people's access to a Cast. Okay. So what I'll talk about, because I'm thinking maybe people haven't read the book, is very briefly what I think are the key arguments of the book. And I think there's three key arguments. The first is the one you might sort of be most familiar with. It's probably the most important of his arguments that had global reach, particularly. And it's an argument about de-skilling. Here, Eddie argues against Braverman's thesis of the generalized de-skilling of work, what Braverman called the degradation of work. You heard Ari talk about Harry Braverman's Labor and Monopoly Capital. So Braverman argued that with the de-skilling of work or the degradation of work, there was the homogenization of a workforce through Taylor separation of mental and manual tasks. As part of the process of capitalist development, in which the detailed division of labor, which was specific to capitalism, separates the labor process, cheapening those components. And then, as more aspects of the labor process were divided, Braverman argued, workers lost their skill monopolies. So what Eddie shows instead is that how white unions and white workers, and he focuses on the Iron Molder Society, the IMS, a union at the time, contested de-skilling to maintain over time some of that craft control, and it kind of shifts how they do it and how much control they maintain, etc. But how their efforts then changed throughout the decades was a big part of what he's writing about, right, in the first half of the book. Thus, de-skilled craft workers actively organized to draw boundaries around their work to reinforce their position in the labor process, and by controlling what was the definition of their work, what apprenticeship looked like. So if you're an apprentice, you're getting into the job. So they controlled the entry into the skilled jobs by organizing to exclude semi-skilled workers from unions via a closed shop agreement, and then to include them later on, and then to exclude them later, another moment later on when Black workers move into semi-skilled work, vis-a-vis or via a de facto kind of job reservation clause that they got through in the Industrial Council. So their strategies altered in relation to changes in the labor process, state regulation, and capital coordination and competition. De-skilling then was not automatic. Instead, Eddie argued that worker and union organizing affected its shape and outcomes. Instead, and furthermore, that racial divisions within the workforce altered these processes. That is, that there was not a homogeneous workforce of de-skilled workers, but a complex reproduction and transformation of racial divisions. skill, its meaning and content is, as he says, socially constructed, and we might say more directly, politically contested. The second argument that he makes in the book is about class politics. Specifically, he asked, what explained the emergent independent Black trade union movement of the 1970s and 80s? Here he makes the critical intervention that to answer this question requires an understanding of the concrete labor process and its changes. He shows how over time, new workforces were brought into semi-skilled and unskilled jobs in the foundries as the labor process began to mechanize. First, white workers contested these boundaries. So white workers were fighting other white workers, and then colored workers, and then African workers when the labor process shifted to mass production. Skilled white craft workers were threatened by this de-skilling at each turn, but used various strategies to contest it and maintain their power over their skills, over the union, and over the jobs and pay. Yet he shows how semi-skilled and unskilled workers come to occupy key locations within the production process. And thus, while in de-skilled jobs, these workers could gain new leverage and which had new bargaining power. This combined with political economic conditions like recession, with organizing efforts from prior moments, and with wider societal resistance, for instance, and he mentioned specifically the 1976 Soweto uprising, to give impetus to new unions. Class struggle then must be understood within longer historical relations, within changes to capitalism in situ, not as a teleology of capitalist development, which insists on taking seriously those concrete relations and which attends to the contradictions at play. And if you read the book, that's what he's outlining for us. The third argument is an argument which is another reason to republish this book now. And it's about racial capitalism. This gives us an example of how racial capitalism reproduces itself, okay? And Burawoy has a nice sort of focus on this in his preface. But in some ways, Eddie didn't make a theoretical argument about racial capitalism, right? He was in this milieu of debate, and he wasn't necessarily theorizing it, but he was demonstrating it. So Eddie begins cast in a racial mold with the race-class debate, arguing that neither position could predict the emergence of the militant independent trade unions, right? Neither the liberals, who thought that capitalism would override the prejudices of apartheid, nor the Marxists, who argued conversely for how race was functional to capitalist expansion and development. Caste could explain the emergence of the labor movement because it examined the labor process, the way work is organized on the shop floor, that hidden abode. Of course, as his book painstakingly shows, the labor process must be understood in terms of what Burawoy calls the politics of production. Now, Eddie doesn't use the politics of production. In fact, he uses the term politics of production, but he's talking about Paul Thompson. And what he means there in the book is actually a narrow workplace politics. But he uses the concept of, he's using Thompson, politics of production, and what Thompson's calling global politics. And the idea that you start at, or that it involves the workplace and that it expands, right? And that is very much in line with Burawoy, Michael's book that's published in the same year, Politics of Production, which is to say that the wider political apparatus, which helps to explain the reproduction of capitalist relations. Thus, Eddie writes of migrant workers, they share a distinct form of oppression and that accounts for the different form of worker organization to which they adhere. Their involvement in the union goes beyond a demand for representation in the foundry. It has become a struggle against the system of racial capitalism. And the sentence that Burawoy quotes in his preface, and is the last sentence of the book, the dilemma facing South Africa's system of racial capitalism lies in the fact that a process of de-racialization of the workplace has begun without an accompanying de-racialization in society at large, right? Which is the politics of understanding racial capitalism. And we can certainly see the implications of those arguments for today. So what strikes one in reading Cast was how he was engaging with a range of contemporary debates, Braverman and de-skilling, Taylorism and scientific management, the function of migrant labor. And he was discussing this in the context of also trying to explain what's happening with the independent Black trade unions. He's got the wonderful chapter on Mao at the end where he just gives you the politics of that process, right? It's been a long time since I've read another kind of equally analytical analysis of the internal debates of unions, right? Not big, what's happening up here policy-wise, but what are unions really do? How are they debating it? How are they understanding what's going on? And how are they taking decisions about what their process is going to look like? What I think is interesting about, though, is, and when you get this, when you all have your copies now, so you can read Burawoy's preface, Burawoy uses a certain number of his own terms when he's trying to explain what Eddie's doing. He uses that Eddie does not use. He uses the word field. Eddie does not use the Bourdieusian field. He uses structuration. Eddie does not use Giddens's structuration. And he also uses colonial despotism. Eddie doesn't use colonial despotism. He uses what he calls racial despotism, which is basically colonial despotism. And so I think there is something very interesting about how, and Burawoy's making a point with these terms because he's trying to argue that Eddie is very clearly making a structural analysis of these combined relations in their historical moment, right? And Burawoy goes to these sociological concepts. It's very interesting to me that Eddie doesn't offer the theorization, but shows the dialectical shift over time from the concrete. And I sort of tried to make this argument at the end of last year in another session on Eddie and Jackie, that this was very much a conjunctural argument. And Michael wasn't buying it, but now I see why. So I think one of the things that we can do with Eddie's work is to push this kind of analysis, right? To really understand what it means to root our politics in a specific historical set of conjunctures now, right? There are a couple of areas, and then I'll close, which I think that we can also take forward. Skill. We don't do enough in labor sociology examining skill. And this is particularly important with our work on new technologies. Eddie's work was on new technologies, but he talked about how skill changed and how the political terrain was about the definition of skill, right? We have talked about how the political terrain is around technologies. And I think Vish was showing me now you've thrown me. Vish was showing the cover of a new book on technology, so we'll look for that. But this is an area which I think we can expand it. Of course, there's no gender in this, and that's something that Ari mentioned. I want to, we can think about Asanda Benya's work as well. And then, of course, and Eddie was doing this himself, how does politics, how does capitalist change relate to new kind of politics that extend beyond the workplace? And that's what he was doing with precarious workers, informal workers, gig economy workers, and many of you are doing that kind of work. But do that work through a conjunctural analysis is the kind of invocation I think that the book is calling us to. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. I think next is Tabang. And I'm also going to throw you by just standing there to take anything where you're comfortable.
Okay, thank you so much. So what I'm going to do to talk to casting a racial mold is, titled what I'm going to talk about, the working class has not left the building. Yeah. And, it's in the context of the changing nature of work, where work is being changed by neoliberal globalization, by technological change. And, what accompanies these neoliberal globalization and technological change is often increase in unemployment, insecurity, casual work, informal work, and also, the fragmentation of the labor market, right, which has undermined the power of organized labor. I'm going to start with a book that was published in 1982. This one was published in 1985. And the book that was published in 1982 is by Andre Gause, called Farewell to the Working Class. And Andre Gause describes these trends, which I just spoke about, in the labor market as indicating that work is becoming less significant as a focus for political mobilization. So Andre Gause's conclusion is based on the view that the process to abolish work is already underway and likely to accelerate. That a society based on mass unemployment is emerging right before our eyes, and that work can never be a source of personal fulfillment or the center of our lives. In other words, what Gause puts forward is that the identities of workers are changing and that work is becoming less central to workers' lives, and that work is losing its importance as a vehicle of collective identities and solidarities. Now, Gause belongs to a group of scholars, along with many others, that are loosely called the end of labor thesis. Okay? And the end of labor thesis basically predicts that labor is no longer a counter-hegemonic force. And indeed, even today's technological changes have led to renewed arguments and the widespread view that labor has become an irrelevant force for social change. So they claim that the working class has left the building as a blunt historical force. Now, Eddie challenges the end of labor thesis. Okay, in the casting the racial mold, does that by illustrating the fact that work was central to mobilizing the identities of workers and forming solidarities to challenge oppression in the workplace and in society. Now, Eddie challenges the end of labor thesis by asserting that work among precarious workers and the unemployed remains a focus of social and political mobilization in South Africa, and that work is not losing its centrality and its importance as an anchor of collective identities and solidarities. And throughout his career as a labor sociologist and activist, Eddie was engaged in a critical reflection on the relationship between labor and capitalism in South Africa. And since the 1970s, he explored the lives of Black workers in a bifurcated labor market and a society based on racialized capitalism. But what distinguishes his work is the way in which he explores and gives attention to agency, to workers' agency and collective power to resist oppression. Okay, so he doesn't just describe the oppression, but he also takes keen interest in showing what the oppressed do in return, which is, resistance is the birth of working class politics. So casting a racial mold demonstrates two things that I want to focus on. And the first is that working class identities were a significant focus for political mobilization in the 1970s. And even today, work remains a significant focus of political mobilization. So in the 1970s, Black workers began to organize into trade unions to challenge the dualistic nature of South Africa's labor relations system. The labor market was fragmented along racial lines, where Black workers, semi-skilled, were organized, where Black workers and their organizations were excluded from the official discourse of labor rights. For Eddie, the bifurcated workplace was inseparable from the bifurcated society in which it was located. In other words, the realm of production was not isolated from the societal struggles of workers outside in their communities. So the concept of social movement unionism is one of the concepts which in his later work captures his commitment to not only workers, but social justice. Like he stands on the principle of social justice, and social movement unionism is a concept that recognizes that trade unions have two faces, Eddie argued. The one, economic, and the other, social and political. Secondly, the book demonstrates that precariousness was part of wage labor from the dawn of capitalism. Precarious work of semi-skilled Black workers in the foundries did not lead workers to reject wage labor, okay, as an avenue for collective identities and solidarity. Instead, what Eddie shows in Casting a Racial Mold is how Black workers transformed precarity into an energy to experiment with political possibilities, to challenge their working and living conditions. And by focusing on production, Eddie shows how precarity is a result of capital's transformation of the labor process in an effort to remove impediments to accumulation, and how this often spurs political mobilization as workers resist precarity by staking demands for improved conditions and wages. Now, I want to speak a little bit about Recasting Workers' Power, which is Eddie's latest book, which was published a few months before his untimely passing. Now, casting workers' power picks up on the themes explored in Casting a Racial Mold. So it's a continuation of sorts, and that's how he saw it, right? As he put it, going back to the past to make sense of the future. So he went back to Casting a Racial Mold to make sense of technological change that is happening today in the platform economy. And he called it Recasting Workers' Power. Okay? And in particular, so Recasting Workers' Power picks up on the theme of work being a significant focus for political mobilization and a vehicle for collective identities and solidarity. But the difference with Recasting Workers' Power is that in this period, the trade union movement, has suffered a series of defeats. That's the key difference, right? And trade union organization membership density have declined globally. Precarity is being extended through outsourcing of work, through platform work, and mass unemployment. Okay? And what these arguments have done is that they've provided strong arguments for the end of labor thesis, right? And in the digital age, there had been renewed skepticism over organized labor's future, okay? And, there's a series of arguments why organized labor could not organize platform workers, that they're dispersed geographically, that they're isolated, and that they are defined as independent contractors rather than workers. And collectively, what these things do is that they subdue the power of labor, right? So now I have to wrap up. Okay. So in recasting workers' power, Eddie and his co-workers challenged the end of labor thesis by returning to the theme of the labor process and resistance from casting a racial mold. And they show how gig work based on digital labor platforms precipitates new forms of worker resistance. In South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, food couriers appropriated the very technologies used by management to exercise control to strengthen their own bargaining position. Food couriers leveraged digital technologies to organize WhatsApp groups, mutual aid organizations, credit and savings cooperatives, and associations, and even industrial action. And such industrial action for platform workers was taking place outside of traditional trade unions or bargaining councils. So precarious workers are exploring new forms of collective solidarity, right, in a context of informal work mediated by digital platforms. So the relevance of casting a racial mold today is in the importance of, one, identifying what work is actually taking place, what is the labor process, and what form does worker resistance take. Okay, and casting a racial mold is not only relevant to labor process and worker resistance, but it's also in the nature of capitalism. To understand capitalism, chapter 1, I'd recommend, right?
We have a long way.
Okay. And my closing sentence will be this. Rather than bidding farewell to the working class, Eddie would urge us in a different direction. That is to get involved with workers, to work with them collaboratively on research projects, and to strategize collectively with them to transform the nature of work.
Why do I feel like why do I feel like that last sentence was directed at me? Thanks, Tabang. Andres?
Yet.
10 minutes.
Having played in a rock band, I know that the last band to play gets the best audience because they kind of warm up by then. But I think in an academic context, that may not be true. Do your thing, academic brother. So let me just get my stopwatch going.
I don't know what Bridget did. Bridget had a watch.
Okay. The molding of a classic. That's what I call my input here. And I want to start with two Websterisms. Eddie liked to say whenever he published a book, and that was quite often, this is the kind of book that you can't pick up once you've put it down. Of course, it's the kind of self-deprecation that you get from an Oxford-educated 1820 settler. There's a very self-assured identity that can be this ironic about your books. And when he said this about crowding globalization, I kind of chuckled, and because now he implicated both Rob and I, so I had to build up the confidence to also say that. And the other thing that he liked to say was, you don't kick a dead dog. And he often used this when he was criticized. also one rather ugly SASA Congress when he was described as the death of a salesman and the birth, the death of an intellectual and the birth of a salesman. Eddie took it on the chin and afterwards said, "You don't kick a dead dog." So he's someone who also relished in criticism. And I also reread some of the reviews of Caste and the Racial Mold. There was a beautiful debate with Wilmot James after the publication of the book. So Caste and the Racial Mold rightly is described as a classic. I think Burawoy is responsible in some way also for canonizing Eddie's work. There's a difference, though, between a canon and a classic. To quote the literary scholar Harold Bloom, a classic is a book that is so strange that the strangeness becomes commonplace. And we forget how strange it was at the moment when it was published. And I think a lot of what was said in Caste and the Racial Mold, that's now taken as a given. But at the time, it was quite revolutionary. So what is a classic? The Roman, it has Roman roots in Latin, classici, which refers to that which befits the upper class. It's that which survives barbarism. And this obviously calls up Bourdieu and the idea of cultural capital, and that literary judgment is often about taste and not necessarily the content of the work. But the classic is also, and I don't think we can only reduce the content of books to just taste. Historical accident, when it was published, the context. A classic is also that which stands up against criticism over time. Anki Mukherjee, in responding to 2 essays by T.S. Eliot and James Coetzee, both called What is a Classic, points out, and this is interesting, that it's often provincials who are obsessed with the question about what is a classic. T.S. Eliot, being an American, reinventing himself as a Londoner at the end of the Second World War, and James Coetzee obviously talking about Bach in Europe and later on getting the Nobel Prize. Us provincials like to think of ourselves as worthy of the metropolis. And Said, in a way, makes that point. Obviously, the critique of the colonial canon as about not time, that which stands up to criticism over time, but Said argues that it's rather space in addition to time. That we also, when we look at classics and what's considered a classic, there's a core and a periphery in how all of this is constructed. So speaking now from the provinces about Caste and the Racial Mold, I encountered the book when I was trained as an honor student in labor process theory. And the shadow of Braverman loomed large. Bridget gave a good overview of the de-skilling thesis. And there was a general pushback against the structuralism in Braverman. Richard Edwards introduced the idea of segmented labor market, bureaucratic control, technological control, and direct control. Andy Friedman made an argument that workers sometimes resisted de-skilling and created zones of responsible autonomy. And Michael Burawoy, of course, spoke about despotic control and hegemonic control, that control is sometimes more subtle and involves playing along, making out, and playing with the rules. So this is the context, in a way, in which Caste and the Racial Mold was also published. But apart from Burawoy, interestingly enough, very few of these books engaged worlds other than the world of the capitalist core. Basically, the US and the UK. They were quite north-centric. And it's interesting that in his debate with Wilmot James, Eddie mentions Michael Burawoy as an exception here, in that Burawoy recognizes colonial despotism and that he also works on Zambia in addition to other parts of the world. Bill Freund, interestingly enough, in his review, Bill Freund he was quite hardcore. He's really complimentary of Kastner racial mold, and he makes the point that Kastner racial mold introduces these debates to the South African context in book form. So that's the moment when people beyond the group of people working at WITS can read about these debates. So in a way, Eddie introduces Braverman and the labor process debates to the South African context. And Ari spoke about the context in which that happened. At the time, Northern labor studies were highly specialized boys' clubs. You had the boys specializing in industrial relations, Fox, Dunlop, Hyman. You had the sociology of work, and that was labor process theory. Paul Thompson, Chris Smith, and their group. Later on, you had Foucauldian labor process theorists and anti-Foucauldian labor. It had all these interesting twists and turns, but they were quite, in my reading, quite inward-looking. You had the sociology of trade union, Lane, Geary, Kelly, and others. You had organizational studies, often quite systems theory driven, and you had labor law. And what makes Kastner racial mold really interesting is that it really integrated all of these fields into one book, which I think defines, in a way, the South African tradition of labor studies, that it's less, there are fewer silos in finely tuned fields of expertise when we talk about labor. It also has a strong sense of history. It's socially engaged, and it's interdisciplinary. And we take that for granted. I don't think we should. And it's an interesting part of the tradition that we trained in and what we've done. And I think it's no wonder that labor process theory, in a way, was surpassed later on by global value chains, global production networks, labor geography, and feminist theories of social reproduction. They ignored Arlie Hochschild. I mean, she published early 80s. Those labor process theorists didn't bother So in a way, it's that insularity of Northern labor process theory that I think led to its demise. However, I do think, as Eddie and Bridget have argued, that there's a contemporary relevance for labor process theory, and there's a need to return to it, which I think Tabang's eloquently also argued here. There are new technologies. There's a need for an historical reading of the transformations in class, race, and gender, as well as new forms of dominance and resistance. And obviously, in Kastner racial mold, there are deafening silences. That of gender, which Bridget mentioned, but I think also the ideological constructions of race and white supremacy. And Eyster and Stahl, I think, for example, is not really taken seriously. So the domain of ideas and interiority, I think, are important, especially now that white supremacy is making such a vicious global comeback. Those ideas need to be understood in the ideological formations alongside a reading of the class basis of that. To return to Eddie and a book that you can't pick up once you've put it down again. I think Kastner racial mold is a classic. It's one of the classics, and I think one of the other books that may rival it is Maids and Madams. And they're both books that deal with issues of what we now call intersectionality. In ways long before we use those words, and I think it's an opportune moment. And Veronica Wits Press, thank you for republishing this book and making it available for a new generation of leaders. Personally, I'm embarrassed that Grounding Globalization has double the number of references on Google Scholar to Kastner racial mold. I think Kastner racial mold is the better book. It should have double the number of references. It should be read by a global audience. I think it has global relevance. And Eddie still is not a dead dog. We will keep on keeping him Kamaku.
I knew, if you'll allow, I knew that Michelle always gives me the hardest part of the programs, always. To Ari, to Tabang, to Bridget, to Andres, thank you very much for firstly agreeing to doing this, but also doing a fantastic job in placing this important work today to 2025. I think I want to just say a couple of things. As I don't know if I want to claim this, and Eddie never claimed this title of being a Marxist, but industrial sociologist. We are often criticized for not wanting to put certain concepts first. The concept of race, we are often challenged for not wanting to deal with race. We are also often challenged of not wanting or ignoring gender, and Eddie loved criticism, and often we were criticized for not, right, and prioritizing class. And I always said that if anything, you should read Caste to understand that we did indeed, and we are, as industrial sociologists, as Marxists, take race seriously, much as we take class seriously. And in defense of Eddie, the book Caste says the hidden abode of production being the factory floor. And years later, he says to me, Sarah, the real hidden abode of production is the household. So please rescue that as industrial sociology and do agenda and the real hidden abode. So 1995 was not a safe year to talk about race, to talk about class, to talk about racism, to talk about capitalism. It was not safe, but Eddie never did anything safe. And for the Caste, he was severely punished. Not only, of course, the going to jail, but in even subsequent years, the particular moments about when SWAP was supposed to have been an institute 40 years ago. And the timing of SWAP being in an institute was really unfortunate. Punishment number one. Punishment number two, when Eddie said, I will comply with the system and I will indeed go for an NRF rating. NRF rating, I remember very well, came through, and he understood, I think, he knew that it was not about the work. It wasn't about whether he was indeed an A-rated scientist, because he was, and he didn't need anyone else to say that. But he was severely punished because at a time when it was not conducive, it was not convenient, unlike other academics of the time, he challenged racism. And not just by pontificating, and I think at this point I'm pontificating, Eddie went to the hidden abode and questioned racism in this country using research. But he also tied it with capitalism. For Eddie, it was always about agency. It was about, and he will disagree with me. And the nice thing, like Michael did, the nice thing about talking about Eddie when he can't respond is that we can also give him some terminologies, Bourdieu's field or structuration, right? So you will. He believed in the power of the revolution, right? This is why, indeed, today the book is relevant and should be read today. For the issues that Eddie raised in 1985 of racism, of capitalism, and I want to also echo the real hidden abode of production are still with us today. And this is why we agreed with Michael that this book should be republished, and the foreword speaks to that. I don't want to belabor the point again. I want to thank Wits Press for always taking the risk with us. I'm hoping that the book is going to be read, and it is indeed going to double the citations. Andres. With that, I want to close this evening by paying a particular tribute. Well, I didn't want to start there because I thought I was going to just fall apart. Luli is in the room, and I know that if I were to give her a mic, she will know how to contextualize 1995 and the sacrifices that she and the family had to make for CAST to see the light of day. But as we thought that you, Luli and family had made, you have made bigger sacrifices. And then he says, I want to write more books. I want to now do recasting. And again, I'm sure you will tell many stories about the two books. And Tabang is absolutely right. I think both books need to be read at the same time. And had I thought about it, we would have even done a box, a set, right? And there goes another project, Michelle. True to Michael, when he spoke at Eddie's memorial, he asked us to not forget Eddie's legacy and to continue celebrating it in many ways. And Michelle and I and many of you are contributing to the edited volume, which will see the light of day. But I also want us to also celebrate, continue to celebrate the legacy of Michael. We were intending to republish as well, Maids and Madam, but for another day. And I don't know if Jackie has joined us, but yeah. It's hard to conclude this. It's hard to close this because I've been waiting for this for such a long time. Michelle and I have been working very hard on this, but thank you very much for this. The book is still available. Thank you very much for being here. Luli, as always, thank you. And Alexia is also here. So with that, book launch is closed.